Welcome to the Productive AI podcast, where we aim to simplify AI for business leaders. I'm your host, Troy Angradon. Today on the podcast, we're speaking with Tom Taulli about what AI is and isn't, where we are in the big picture, what's ahead in the next 5 to 10 years, where it's being adopted, and what you should be doing if you are a business leader and you're considering bringing AI into the organization. Tom is an author, investor, speaker, and advisor on technology and finance. He is an author. Some of the recent books include Artificial Intelligence Basics, a non-technical introduction, and the Robotic Process Automation Handbook. And this is all on top of a number of other books in the finance arena, as well as the fact that he's a contributor to Forbes magazine since 1997. Tom, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Troy.
So let's start big picture. Can you give a really concise and clean definition? Just what is artificial intelligence versus expert systems versus machine learning versus deep learning? Because those terms almost get used interchangeably, and I think they confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, sure. And it confuses a lot of experts and founders of companies as well. So, one of the reasons I wrote the book on Artificial Intelligence Basics. So I look at it as a circle. I start with a circle, and that's AI. So AI is just an umbrella that covers so many different topics. And you mentioned some of them. One is, and so each of these will have tiny circles in the big circle. So one of the tiny circles is machine learning. That's one of the oldest forms of artificial intelligence, goes back to the 1950s. It takes in some data, it goes through some algorithm, gets a result, and maybe over time it learns. We saw during this time period programs, to learn how to play chess, or we saw one that it was called ELIZA, which you could communicate with a teletype, and it was a virtual psychoanalyst. If you had some issues, with your marriage or whatever it was, ELIZA would help you out. And it actually kind of freaked out the inventor who created this, because people actually thought that this was real. And it really wasn't. It was some basic technology. And a lot of it was repetitive. Psychologically, we kind of thought that, a lot of people thought it was real. So that's more of machine learning, traditional machine learning. So what happened was that we had these winters in AI during the 70s and 80s and 90s. We had several of these winters where AI went out of favor, primarily because the computer systems were just not good enough to have really practical, commercial, capable technology. It would go out of favor, but then during the 70s and probably late 70s and the 80s, we saw expert systems. And this was a form of machine learning, but more of taking a lot of if-then statements. So we'd get an expert, someone in, say, supply chain, and then he or she would do a brain dump, and then we would just somehow map that all into a computer system, and it would automate kind of how an expert would handle a problem. And the first application of that was digital equipment. And it was a recommendation system where I'm looking to buy some computer systems. It would actually help you do that. And it made a ton of money. It was very successful. There's a problem with expert systems, and that is they're just extremely difficult to maintain. Knowledge changes, information changes, and you have to go back into those if-then statements and reconfigure everything. So it just really wasn't a practical thing. So eventually these expert systems kind of faded out. We also saw during this time what are neural networks, and that's another one of those circles within the big circle. And the neural networks was actually created back in the late 50s, but never really gained much traction. It was also called perceptron, and but the computer systems just weren't able to work those. But we had these great minds that kind of went, were iconoclasts during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, like Geoffrey Hinton, who didn't give up on these concepts and kept focusing on them and building these systems and creating theories. And their thinking was that eventually the technology would get fast enough and sophisticated enough where neural networks and deep learning would actually make sense and actually work. And that's what's happened during the last 10 years with the GPUs, with the availability of huge amounts of data, with the theoretical background and deep learning. This whole category has just exploded in importance. And it's primarily used for recognition of images or video and things of that sort. So you take in a lot of data on one end. It goes through these neurons, and each neuron has different weightings. And then there's kind of like the optimization, functions in there that iterate through this and try to get good results and also go through different layers. It's just really complicated stuff. But basically it's taking a lot of data, going through a lot of iterations, a lot of stuff that we as human beings really can't do, and coming up with results. And what it usually does is find patterns that we as humans really have a difficult time and maybe impossible for us to come up with. So deep learning is really the big area for the last 10 years. There's also different types of networks being created, like generative adversarial networks, and that actually creates data. Because one of the problems we have right now is, we just don't have enough data. You'd be surprised. I mean, we do create a lot of data, but a lot of this data is not useful. So there's actually GANs, generative adversarial networks. They're kind of like cage fights between neural networks that create data, so that the generative adversarial networks, or GANs, this has been maybe the last 5 or 6 years. It was created by someone who was an academic who went on to Google. Now he's a major person at Apple. Ian Goodfellow is the person who created the GAN, and he's become a superstar in AI. He was looking at this problem of data. Whatever you look at, whether it be expert systems, machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, doesn't matter. It's all about data. And the problem is we don't always have enough data. It's unimaginable data, on Facebook. And why is Facebook or Google, why are those companies at the leading edge of AI? Well, because they have the data. But what is amazing is there's really still not enough data to do what we want to do. And so GANs are a way to create new data. We're seeing a lot of interesting innovation with new types of networks, new types of algorithms, but also a lot of innovation to find ways to create new data. So this has all been done over decades of time, and and it's accelerating the growth. But the way to look at it is AI is a really broad topic that includes a lot of smaller topics, but they all have a theme of data as being the heart of it, and using some type of algorithm. And these systems tend to get better, smarter over time.
So let's talk about the strong versus weak, or the general versus narrow.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? First, let's describe what that is, because a lot of people listening might not know what that is, and then we'll work our way through.
Yeah. It actually goes back a long time with Turing. We have the Turing test, where you talk to a computer, to a computer and to a person. You're not too sure who's who, and if you can't differentiate between them, then it's considered intelligent. And that would be an example, probably a pretty good example of what strong AI would be. If you could talk to it, feel like you're just talking to a regular person. That's a pretty good. That's a very high level, pretty enormous amount of intelligence to achieve that. We're not there. We'll get there, I'm sure, at some point, but that would be strong AI. Weak AI or narrow AI is where we're at today. Like Siri's good, but you really can't have a really open-ended conversation with Siri.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of AI we'll have AI to look at a X-ray to see if there's cancer, but that AI is not going to also figure out what type of medicine to have if you have a cold. Real AI, I could learn, and I could take something and apply it to another domain and understand another domain even better. We're nowhere.
Which is fundamentally a human attribute, at least as far as we know, that we are the first ones to have that attribute. And I think that's, to me, has always been the defining characteristic or difference between sort of general or narrow, is this multi-domain aspect.
Yeah, it's learning transference of learning. And you'll hear about all these different types of learnings: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and so forth. But there's transference, and that is just taking learning from one area and applying it to another. Very complicated, not easy to do with a computer.
What are your thoughts on how soon we do get to artificial general intelligence? And
Mhm,
if you listen to Elon Musk, of course, he's like, look, in 5 years, we're going to have general intelligence. Nobody understands how fast we are developing these
mhm,
systems, and we're going to have these things take over the world. And he's very vocal about the fact that Google DeepMind project, he doesn't like it. What did he
mhm.
say? It's like the War Games movie from 1980.
Yeah.
And then you get at the other end of the spectrum, folks like Kai-Fu Lee, right, who came through, was it Google,
Mhm,
Microsoft, and Apple, I think,
mhm,
and then now is doing Sinovation Ventures.
mhm,
And his whole take on it is that really this could be literally hundreds of years away.
mhm.
Where do you fall on
I think it's a tough problem to
that?
solve. Predicting technology is a hazardous
Yeah.
activity. When the iPhone came out, Ballmer said, "Yeah, it's kind of like a toy. It's a nice toy, but it's not going to go anywhere." But I do think it. Uh, we are seeing some amazing innovation and breakthroughs and advances, and we'll get there. We'll get there. The timing is
Do
I'm
you
not
think we'll
sure.
get there in your lifetime?
I
Our
hope
lifetime?
so. I hope so. I do think,
Yep.
and this is the other thing too. Um, we have billions of people. I mean, do we have to replicate people? I mean, we have enough, more than enough people with great brains. We should really focus technology on things that we can't do very well. There's so many things that computers can do that we would never be able to do.
Right.
Uh, so I do think a lot. That's why I think a lot of it may take a little longer because a lot of the investment is not on AGI. It's really on weak AI and doing things that humans probably really can't do well.
Let's focus down on the next 10 years, kind of keep it
Mhm.
in something that we have a line of sight towards.
Well, there's the crossing of the chasm
Hmm.
concept.
Sure.
At what point does it become mainstream? I mean, we have Alexa. People are kind of comfortable talking to their Alexas and interacting with Alexa. That's pretty sophisticated AI.
Right.
Jeffrey Hinton, who I mentioned before, he's kind of the godfather of deep learning, said we're never going to have an AI winter because we all have smartphones. I mean, we're not going to get rid of our smartphones. I
Right.
mean, we're not going to get rid of our Alexa devices. It's kind of here already. I mean, we're living it. We may not call it AI, but we as a society are getting comfortable with these technologies as just being a
Hmm.
normal part of our everyday life, and that these are getting smarter and better and more sophisticated. So I think I think when we talk about the autonomous concept, and it's usually about autonomous cars.
Sure.
Wozniak has said he won't see it in his lifetime. I consider him kind of a young guy still. Because as you get older, everyone else seems to not be as old as he thought they were.
I thought that was just me.
Yeah. So I think there's some things that are just really complicated. We have a lot of obviously smart companies gunning for the autonomous vehicle,
Sure.
uh, and there's been a lot of innovation there, but driving a car is at night and trying to avoid pedestrians is not an easy thing to do,
No.
and we're not there. We're not there. So, and it's proven more difficult than we thought it would. And that's what I
Right.
think is, it's kind of that last. There's always, speaking of cars, it's kind of that last mile is always the toughest part, and I think that's probably what we will be running into over time. So we're going to see definitely a lot of innovation. I'm not sure we're going to necessarily see a completely autonomous car within 10 years. I mean, maybe 20 years, maybe 15. 10 could be tough.
And Musk is claiming he'll have level five on the five autonomous. What is it? Maturity scale,
Yeah,
5-step maturity scale. He's saying level five autonomous will be here in less than 5 years.
he's an amazing person and
Yeah,
will go down in history as one of the greats. No
I think
question about
so.
that. He's always missed deliveries and, made claims. I mean, weren't we supposed to, wasn't he supposed to have like a ride sharing service already? Wasn't that his big
Yes.
thing last
Yeah.
year?
Turn your Tesla car into a robo taxi.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm not sure if I've
Yeah.
seen that yet. Um, 5 years, probably a little optimistic, and that's coming, probably makes sense coming from someone who has skin in the game and is an optimist, definitely a technology optimist.
He's an extreme pessimist on the artificial general intelligence
Well, I
issue.
think he's more about the consequences of the technology. I think he's
Yeah,
probably
exactly.
optimist about the development and the progress of the technology, and
For
the
sure.
power of the technology.
Yeah.
We're going to probably get close, but just me, it'll be hard to get it to complete autonomous level five.
Right.
There's probably going to be some exceptions, and we have a legal system and regulators, and things always take more time than they want.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about adoption, kind of modern day, like where we are today.
Hmm.
You do a lot of work. You are an advisor to startups. You've been
Hmm.
an investor or are an investor in startups.
Hmm.
You also work with a lot of enterprises as a consultant. What is your
Yeah.
take on where we are today in terms of like, let's just talk enterprise Fortune 500. Let's talk US centric, because obviously the Europe market is different, the Asia market is different. So
Yeah.
for the North American market, the,
Yeah.
let's say, Fortune 500, where are they in terms of adoption in your mind?
Well, there's different ways of looking at it. One is there's if you have Salesforce.com, it comes with Einstein, which is their AI system. A lot of big companies have
Hmm.
Salesforce, so they also have Einstein. I'm assuming, and I've talked to Salesforce, and they tell me that a lot of those companies are using Einstein for forecasting and figuring out what is a good lead, what's a hot lead, what is a lead just to avoid for now. There's a
Sure.
lot of companies using AI. They may not even know it, but
I
they're
think
using
that's the
it.
key, isn't it? They're
Yeah,
using existing, probably software as a service, SaaS
yeah,
applications, and those vendors like Salesforce are doing AI in the back.
that's right. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, ERP is moving in that direction. All these
Hmm.
different core enterprise parts are moving more and leveraging on AI. So just by owning one of those and having one of those systems in your company,
Sure.
you're going to benefit from AI.
Hmm.
Then there's the other part where companies have their own data and they realize it's valuable. So can they do their own AI project to leverage on that?
Right.
That's where it gets a little more complicated. And there's so many different studies from IDC, Gartner that talk to executives, and it's definitely hit or miss. There's a lot of AI projects that never go beyond proof of concept. The scaling it out, putting it into production, getting people that actually adopt it. It's proven really really difficult for a lot of companies, even technology companies or companies that are just great companies. It's just one of those things that AI is a bit of a different animal because it's more about probabilities. It's about data. It's not just dropping some type of you know system that stores information and collects information and alerts you and things. I mean, it goes way beyond that. So it takes a
Sure.
different skill set for companies. So on the one hand, I think there's a lot of adoption, and then it may not be something that these companies realize that they are adopting AI, but they
Hmm.
are. And then there are a lot of other companies still trying to do it on their own, and that could cause some problems too, because do you really need to? I mean, if there's a ticketing system, say ServiceNow, I've talked to ServiceNow, they're doing a lot more with AI. I mean,
Hmm.
am I going to create my own ticketing system that uses AI when ServiceNow has it, and they have a lot more data than I
Right.
have, and they have probably better data scientists than I have to make that work. But you're going to see companies. We saw this. We've seen this so many times over the years where companies think, well, we'll do it on our own. We'll create our own systems. And then $100 million later, and they have nothing to show for it. And the CEO gets canned. It's happening as we speak. And there's some
Yeah.
companies that are probably going to regret that they've, tried to do everything on their own.
Okay, so in terms of adoption, one of the things I've been looking at a lot is the like which sectors are sort of further ahead. Now, obviously,
Hmm.
it's not the entire sector; it's probably the leaders in each of these sectors that are
Yeah.
really far ahead. It's a standard Pareto, 20/80 rule,
Hmm.
or long tail kind of curve. But the ones that I've seen a lot of would be financial services. So we're talking
Hmm.
banking, wealth management, to some degree insurance.
Hmm.
You're seeing obviously a lot of retail,
Hmm.
which is using it for things like credit risk, supply chain management, customer segmentation would be a big one there.
Hmm.
What else are you seeing? Where else are you seeing? Which industries or which companies in those industries are really running down the track as the innovators and early adopters?
Oh, I mean, definitely retail and finance are, and you would not think they would be, but anywhere, any category that has a lot of data is probably going to probably have some experience with machine learning. Maybe not necessarily deep learning, but probably machine learning. So
For
the
sure.
banking system is a prime example of that. I mean, they've been doing this for decades. I mean,
Hmm.
how to figure out how to provide credit to someone in a safe manner and things like that. With the COVID situation, I think you're seeing companies, like manufacturing companies, um, getting more, urgent about how they deal with, changes. We're talking about supply chain. So all of a sudden, there's a big change, and how do you deal with that? I do think that having a better digital AI ML strategy allows for that. Healthcare is another category that you're seeing a lot of work with AI. I think COVID is, we have all these data sets come from COVID, and I think we're seeing a lot of analysis of those data sets. It's kind of been hit or miss, but at least they're trying. Medical does have the problem of regulation. You are seeing a lot of advances with identification, like with X-rays and diagnosis and things of that sort. So you just got to follow the data. I mean, if an industry doesn't have a lot of data, there's probably not going to be not much of an opportunity for AI. There's a lot of companies where that or industries that probably doesn't really work, and AI may not be an option for them.
Right. And then I think there's also a size dimension here too, where
Yeah,
it's really this is still an expensive game to
yeah,
play, especially
yeah,
if you're building it, actually building systems for it, kind of like you said there. If you're using an application, that's one thing, and it
yeah,
has some AI in the back. But if you really want to do your own AI, build your own models, which
no,
are essentially prediction engines for
yeah,
somebody who's not familiar with it, then you're building a lot of data, cleaning a lot of data, training this system to
yeah,
understand what to do with the data. So that's still expensive, very expensive. And
yeah,
so I think that, the ones I've seen that when I look at all across all these case studies, the folks that are doing it in house seem to be kind of the biggest of the big in each of their
hmm,
sectors. So
hmm,
they're in a
yeah.
sector that's advanced and they are at the top of that sector.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, Andreessen Horowitz, two of the partners, wrote a blog piece, maybe it was last year, that they did a kind of a postmortem of all the different companies, AI companies they have invested in, and came up with all these different conclusions. And one is that it's not a really pure SaaS play, because even in the same industry, different companies have different data sets and different requirements, and so there tends to be a higher degree of customization required for these models to work. That adds to the cost. The other thing that adds to the cost is just if you have dealing with a ton of data, especially video data or image data, that actually gets pretty expensive. And if you're dealing with
Mhm.
the processing that all in real time, and then, of course, you just have the expenses with data scientists. And, those people are not cheap. So, their position was not necessarily that AI is not worthy of investment, but the models might be different. The business models might be different, and the types of margins might be different with these types of companies versus what we've seen with SaaS cloud companies.
Yeah, I remember that article, and I think that the takeaway that I walked out of there with was around this idea that we have to treat these companies as more like service companies when it comes to
Yeah,
valuation and cost
exactly.
structures
Yeah,
than as product companies.
yeah,
And I thought that was a really interesting insight. And I think a lot of people in the industry stood up and took notice and said, "Oh," because they were probably launching as a typical startup, saying, "We're going to be a product company. We're going to have
mhm,
this much valuation against our earnings or profits or
right.
whatever revenues or whatever." And then I think that was a bit of a wake up call to say, well, maybe maybe
Yeah,
not. You're kind of every one of your customer projects is kind of a unique snowflake. You're not really getting a lot of leverage and repeatability.
yeah, That's right.
Yeah. So I think that'll be
That's right.
interesting to see how that plays out in the long run. There's another excellent post. I think it might have been Mark Andreessen actually. It was a post or a talk he gave where he said, we're still trying to figure out if AI is a feature or a fundamental
Yeah,
replatform.
it's a
And
good
I
point.
thought that was neat that they were willing to just say, we're not sure.
Yeah, still early days
Yeah.
with this, and now these VCs are smart, entrepreneurs are smart, and they'll probably find ways to make a buck out of it. But right now, it's probably a little dicey. A little dicey.
One of the things that I want to help people understand is kind of what is the state of the art. And by that, I mean, what's possible today that people may not even understand is possible.
They're definitely making a lot of advances. And they're also, part of that is the GANs that we talked about, that it creates, it can create this content. And so when you're having a conversation, you need some of the creativity of, that creative process and spark is required. So we're seeing the convergence of a lot of things coming at once. Also, the models for these NLP models, have like 150 billion parameters, which is just mind-boggling. Uh, so these, these massive, super hyperscale type models that just a couple years ago were no one really knew if they would work or not, are actually working, and having practical uh, effect. And like you said, they it's not just the a response, kind of the ELISA, what I talked about. It's definitely more of an engaging conversation that you would have with another person. And there's still a lot that needs to be done. Wall Street Journal did have an article about this, and while these NLP systems are clearly a lot more sophisticated than they're before, they're not really good at reasoning or logic. And again, the transference, transfer learning is not there. So I mean, there's certain things that we as humans can just kind of deduct. Just through our experiences, we just can kind of figure things out that these computers really still can't do that. It hasn't got to that point where it's the reasoning part, it's the logic, it's the making the conclusions, the reasonable, rational conclusions based on experience and knowledge. That's a tough nut to crack.
So we can have fairly comprehensive or interesting, maybe single track conversations,
Mhm.
but we can't ask them complex questions and ask them to reason things out
I
in
mean, the
complex
conversation we're
conversations.
having now, I don't think would really work with you know,
Right.
you know. Now,
Well, what about with GPT-3? And I had an interesting conversation, which I'll
yeah,
fill you in on here too. But
okay, yeah,
let's talk about what that is first, and then what
yeah.
are your thoughts on that?
Well, from what I understand, it's OpenAI has created the system, which is a very sophisticated NLP system. I don't think they've officially released it to the public. They're an interesting company, OpenAI, because they feel like if their technology can be misused, they don't want to put it out to the real world. Um, and so but I think they've made it available to different companies that have experimented with it and tried it out. Apparently, it is
They have, yeah.
pretty path breaking.
What does it do? Just for
It's
somebody who's not
just
familiar with this.
it's kind of like it could do something like write a short story. You know, I mean, it's kind of crazy. You could put like one sentence, tell it one sentence, and it'll come up with a story. And it kind of goes to the GAN we talked about.
Hmm.
It's a really sophisticated GAN, I suppose, but it's a way to you know you could give it a little information and it gets creative and does and it's actually pretty engaging. So and kind of a little creepy and scary and spooky at the same time. So
Because they pretty much ingested, if I recall correctly, it was like 10 times more than any other system of its kind has ever
yeah,
sort of ingested in terms of data. And
yeah, the
they didn't just,
hyperscale is crazy.
they, right, and they kind of crawled the web just like Google would or
Yeah,
any of the major search engines and found everything
yeah,
that they could find and then just brought it in as additional text. And So they
That's
kind
right.
of scoured everything that was accessible on the internet and fed it
Yeah.
all to this one system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
It's pretty cool. And yeah, it, and again, like I said, it's like over 100 billion parameters that it's processing. So these are at levels we never thought could be done, and can
Right.
be,
Which again is a big boys game, right? An expensive
yeah,
game. I've heard all sorts of
exactly.
numbers being bandied around on what it
Microsoft,
costs
yeah,
to train this thing. And they
yes,
had to write some custom deal partnership with Microsoft because they were using so many compute resources or something. I mean,
that's right.
there are all sorts of rumors going around about what the cost is to train a system like this and then to run it
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah. And speaking of Microsoft, Microsoft had invested, I think it was last year, $1 billion into OpenAI. And I think recently announced that they've created a supercomputer, one of the fastest computers on the face of the earth, with OpenAI and Microsoft. So Microsoft realizes that compute power is key here, and so it's interesting that a software company is investing heavily in supercomputer technology.
So we've talked about sort of sectors. We've talked about probably this is a big, I would say, a large player game still, just because of the expense.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to shift towards is kind of what is the labor impact. I'm going to come back
Mhm.
to Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. His feeling on this is he says, I think we should stop talking about things like artificial general intelligence, when
Mhm.
these things become as smart as us, and start focusing on the closer term impact, things like
Mhm.
just the impact on the labor force.
Mhm.
How do you think about AI's impact on the labor force? For
Mhm.
better, for worse? Is it
Mhm.
neutral? What's the
Mhm.
time frame? How do you
Mhm.
think about that?
Well, I think it's already impacted the workforce in terms of in different ways. In one way, it's made it so if you're a data scientist, you're going to make a lot of money and be employed for a long time.
Okay.
But there's other areas where you've probably are out of a job, or you're going to be out of a job. Jeffrey Hinton, I think, said if you're a doctor that interprets radiology X-rays, you should probably look for another profession, and probably soon. It's probably coming a lot faster than when we're talking about the, the strong AI. I think that's
Hmm.
far off. I think the job impact of just weak AI is soon. It's happening, and probably in professions you would not think. But I ran into this case. I read about robotic process automation as well. It's not really AI, but it's a way to automate your enterprise. Let me go back. They'll put this in historical perspective. IBM did not get into AI in the 1950s because they did not want to be associated with losing jobs. And whenever I talk to an AI or an RPA CEO and I say, "What about jobs?" they're going to say the same thing. Oh, it enhances people. It makes their job easier. Don't believe it. Don't believe it. It's
Yeah,
not true.
I agree.
They don't want to be the ones responsible for you losing your livelihood, even though that's what's happening. So I'll give a true case study. I won't name the consulting firm, but it's a major consulting firm. LIBOR is the interest rate that's been around for decades in Europe. It's being sunsetted over the next few years. As you can imagine, there are millions of contracts that have LIBOR embedded in those contracts. And if I signed a loan agreement 10 years ago and it's a 30-year agreement, LIBOR, I'm going to have to do something with that contract. I'm going to have to amend that contract. And you can imagine there's so many different types of contracts, and they're all in paper, and that's just a headache. Now, what used to happen is you would hire a ton of consultants from one of the top consulting firms, and they'd spend like 5 years and tens of millions of dollars, and they'd fix it. Well, this consulting firm used NLP, just simple OCR, all these different things. They put it together. They actually built their own little AI platform, and they
Hmm.
had like a group of 5 people that can do this. Not only that, but they can do it like in days, not years.
Right.
I mean, we're talking, I guess, tens of thousands of hours of white collar.
Right.
Those would have been high paying jobs.
Right.
For that project would have been a normal high paying job situation. Not anymore.
Would you
Um,
agree? Would you agree with Dr. Lee's kind of assessment that he has a grid, and I'm not going to do it justice, but it was kind of like lower left and upper right. You always want to be in the upper right of these types of grids. And the lower left, it was basically kind of the X and Y axis was really how complex was the task and how social or collaborative is the task. So his assessment was sort of whether it's white collar or a blue collar job. If it's a simple task that can be done on your own, then that could be done by a robot or it could be done by computer code. And if it's a complex task requiring a lot of social collaboration and empathy, that's probably up in the upper right corner. And that's probably where that kind of the human sweet spot. And you could have human machine sort of working side by side as long as the machines were doing those single domain automatable tasks and the humans were doing the complex social collaborative complex tasks. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's overly simplistic? Or
I think it's a valid way of looking at it, but I also think I look at it from the standpoint of what a business person would look at, and I'd rather not have to hire people that I have to pay $200,000-$300,000 a year versus somebody makes 20 or 25 or 30 grand a year. So if I'm going to look at automation, I'd rather automate those jobs that really impact the bottom line.
Right.
And those are the high paid jobs. So I talked to the CEO co-founder of Automation Anywhere. It's one of the top RPA companies. Met with him last year, and he said in 5 years they're going to make it so they can have an NLP system, an AI system that will understand any contract.
Incredible.
And now he didn't say that's going to mean that we're going to lose a lot of jobs, but I would have to think there's some jobs that are going to be lost because of something like that. I talked to another CEO who brought up another good, and he brought empathy. I think that's key here. Computers are really not empathetic or social, not yet anyway. He brought up the point that we would probably see doctors automated before we see nurses automated.
I think Dr. Lee's assessment of that was something along the lines, not to put words in his mouth, but it was something like the radiologist might go away, but the doctor, or I think to your point, the nurse, the person who's there up front with the patient, doing the patient care and saying, this is what we learned. This is the diagnosis now. Let's talk about how we're going to treat it and what we're going to do, and having that conversation with the family and things like that. That part is kind of protected, at least for now.
Yeah, you look at what a doctor usually does. They give you tests, they do some diagnosis, and then they prescribe something. Those are all things that computer can, at some point, can do. I mean, now as to someone who can care for someone or empathize, or help someone deal with a situation that they're in, a traumatizing situation, computers are really not good at that.
Although on the flip side of that, I mean, in Japan, they're building senior home care robots that have empathy and joke telling, and that they will be proactive and they will check in with the patient, I guess the patient, the owner, and say, "Hi, how are you doing today? Would you like to play a game?" And they'll sort of prompt them to sort of be social and things. So I think we're starting to see early indications of empathetic computing. Which is just another skill set. And as long as it's kind of back to the Turing test, if you can't tell if it's real or genuine, it doesn't matter if it still works for you. I know you've written some posts on these subjects. So I'm curious what your kind of high level response would be. How does AI relate to some of the other technologies people are seeing? So that could be 5G, could be edge computing, meaning putting some compute, let's say in your car or at the edge devices, a factory, something like that, or quantum computing. I know you've kind of written on all those subjects.
Sure.
What's the high speed flyover on those?
Yeah, I think 5G and edge go together hand in hand. But both of those will be huge for AI, because what happens now is if I talk into Siri, some of that can be processed on the phone, but it still has, for other stuff has to be put into the cloud, and there's latency with that.
Right.
So when we kind of compress, the latency is so much less with 5G. So we're going to have much better AI experiences, more real-time AI experiences. Also, 5G allows for more specific and better GPS. So to the point, I think, within a few centimeters. So you can have these virtual, we're always talking about virtual reality and AR and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
It's going to start happening in the next few years because of 5G. So we're going to see
Hmm.
the AI with the AR, the VR, the 5G. Yeah, we've talked about this for so long. Yeah, Sony, I think with VR has kind of done it, but Facebook is, had its head over the, side of the wall multiple times and can't figure it out. And it's going to have so many impacts with learning, the remote work that we're doing nowadays. 5G is going to help, be a huge help for AI. And then quantum computers is a fun topic. Quantum mechanics is another spooky idea that Einstein calls spooky. Where the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. All these different paradoxes that occur in the quantum world that have nothing to do with the world we live in. But
Right.
what makes our subatomic atoms is pretty crazy world. And the thing is, there's like what's the entanglement, where you can have a particle in another universe, another solar system, and one over here, and they basically interact with each other and go past the speed of light. All these things that really confounded Einstein. If you confound Einstein, you're in some crazy territory. So,
and where are we in terms of that art? Because I
yeah,
thought that's been at least 20 years of kind of R&D, and I know that
yeah,
Amazon and Microsoft are now releasing sort of end user quantum access to end user quantum computers.
yeah.
But of course, none of the frameworks exist. We don't really have ways to program them. So where are we? Is this a 5 or 10-year thing or a 20-year thing still?
Well, Microsoft has Q Sharp.
Impact?
Microsoft has Q Sharp, which you can program a quantum computer.
Okay.
It's where it is right now is you could go to a Microsoft and basically if you're a big company, you can go to Microsoft and pay them some money and get access through the cloud, through Azure or IBM's cloud system to their quantum computers.
Sure.
And start doing experiments with them. It's really more at the experimental phase. It's not really at the commercial phase at this point. Yeah, so I think it's probably 3 to 5 years out where we're going to start seeing commercial.
In terms of commercial usage.
Yeah. But the thing is that it's
and what's the intersection with AI?
Speed.
Is it really kind of
I think
just a replatforming? Is it moving beyond GPUs essentially?
It's moving beyond GPUs. So, yeah. So it's the speed. Apparently, the speed. What they do is they'll say, how long does it take to do a classical problem with a CPU versus a quantum computer? And it could be something like a classical problem could take like 10,000 years to solve, and then put it on a quantum computer and it takes a couple minutes to solve, or something crazy. So we're not there yet. It's definitely at the cutting edge, but people I've talked to in the quantum world, I've talked to Honeywell and in different companies that are investing heavily in this, and they're big believers. And they feel that it's going to turn into valuable technology, but it's not tomorrow. It's not like immediate. It's going to take some time.
So folks listening to this, given that we're kind of grounding this in kind of the next 3 to 5 years, they don't need to really worry about the impact of that in AI, or probably generally right now.
No.
So to sort of close this whole thing up, given everything we talked about, kind of where we are in this major wave with all of these sub waves that we're going through in terms of AI and the impact on the labor force, do you have any specific guidance to people who listen to this and they think, I have a simple singular task where I don't collaborate with a lot of people, whether it's a blue collar or white collar job? What's your advice to them?
I don't know if I have really good advice for that, because I do think that I personally believe, I don't think it's immediate, but I do think maybe in the next 10 years, we're going to see a radical transformation of the workforce. And I think you're going to have, people that have spent 10, 20 years in a career, and it's going to be over. Our success rate with retraining and reskilling in this country, or any country for that matter, is pretty poor. If you do something for 20 years and then you have to reskill yourself, it's a heavy lift, as opposed to maybe someone who just gets into the workforce. I think there's going to be a lot of societal disruption through automation. I don't know what the solution is, because I think maybe you could go become a nurse or, something that has more. I think the technology genie, or the Pandoras, or whatever you want to call it, has been let out. There's no way it's going to be put back in. And
Right.
I think there's going to be some major societal disruption because and it's not just AI. I mean, RPA, just RPA alone is going to have a major impact, and it already is. And it's around
And
the
that's,
world.
I know you mentioned it earlier, and that's
Yeah,
robotic process automation. We're not going to talk about it on this call, but
yeah,
I would love to do another meeting and just kind of really unpack that because I think that there is some overlap and
yeah,
intersection between AI and RPA. So we'll
yeah.
do that on a separate call. But you're
Okay.
saying it's automation of business processes, back office or front office,
Yeah,
that will have a big impact.
absolutely.
What about any specific advice or guidance if somebody is listening to this, they're a business leader and they are thinking, we want to bring AI, we think we want to bring AI in, or we
Hmm.
think that we could use AI for
Hmm.
competitive advantage,
Hmm.
differentiation, optimization. What guidance or advice would you give to them?
Well, I think the first thing is we talked about this a little bit. It's a buy versus build analysis.
Right.
I mean, you have to take serious consideration of your resources, your skill sets, your capabilities in your organization, and we tend to overestimate our abilities
Right.
and how much
Right.
tolerance you have for failure.
Right.
Because AI, yeah, smart people doing AI and it fails. I mean, we don't know what that data is going to tell us. We don't know until we
Right.
try all these algorithms and the deep learning and so forth.
Yeah.
That's why I think you have to take a serious assessment of your capabilities, your tolerance for risk and failure. Um, I think probably for most companies, and also, do you have the data? I mean, if you don't have the data,
Right.
it's pretty useless. I mean,
Yeah.
so might as well leverage these off-the-shelf products that have access to data that you can benefit
Right.
from. So look at your CRM. What is it about your does your CRM offer some AI capability? Does your ERP offer that? You know, uh, check it out. Does your supply chain system? Mostly more and more of these supply chain systems are getting smarter. So,
Absolutely. Your
so take
HR
a look.
system, I mean, across the
Yeah,
board, any of
yeah,
those large scale applications that you're running your business on, those vendors are all massively investing in
that's
AI
right.
in the back end.
Yeah, and they have the advantage that they can pool the data with other customers. It's anonymized that data,
Right.
but you don't have that.
Right.
So you're benefiting. There are use cases where you probably would have a great competitive advantage if you did it in house. If you have the data, you have the capabilities, the resources, and the willingness to take the risk, that could be transformative to your company and make you very successful. And we've already seen, we saw Lemonade is this property casualty insurance company that went public. It's done very well. It from the ground up was built with the idea with AI. So if you buy the insurance, you talk to a bot. If you get a claim, it's all done through a bot on your smartphone. On the claim, they do a claim, a third of the claims are resolved purely with an automated bot. And the other thing too, talking about empathy, when someone's filing a claim for like a car accident, I mean, you may have been injured, someone may have died. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
traumatic point in someone's life. So
Right.
if you're able to resolve a third of the time, a very complex process and a very emotionally tender, emotional process, you're onto something. And
Yeah.
then for those two-thirds that were not resolved, when they were then, so Lemonade is a company where they're gunning for, they're elephant hunting. I mean, insurance companies are big. And to disrupt that industry, you have to do something completely revolutionary. And this company, Lemonade, thinks AI is the silver bullet to do that.
And I think
Well,
we're going to start to see the same thing, that a traditional incumbent player that tries to bolt AI on is
mhm,
not going to be as effective as somebody who does a ground up AI first build
mhm. I
in their
I would
space.
agree with that. It's going to be difficult for some of these insurance companies to make that transition, or other companies where Lemonade comes into that industry and is built from the ground up for that. If if there's a leader there and a willingness to make the change and do what needs to be done, and and take some risk, it can be done. But a lot of times,
Okay.
it doesn't work.
So, what are the
Yeah.
best places to reach out to you, connect with you, find your materials, your books, things like that?
I do have a personal website, TOMTAULLI.com.
Okay.
There's a contact form. on there that will reach me. I have the typical Twitter stuff, and you can. There's links to Twitter there. There's links to my books, some of my blogs. If you go to Forbes.com, put my name in Google, it'll show. I could send you a link for that if you want. But yeah, you can just go to my personal website. That's probably the easiest way to contact me.
And then I'll just throw all of those links in the show notes
Yeah.
as well. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being on the show,
Right.
and we'll catch
Right.
up soon.
All right. Thank you very much.